This is possibly one of my favorite quotes about the capability of artificial intelligence and what we might expect of it in the near future. For those of you that aren't familiar, Geoffrey Hinton is one of the giants upon whose shoulders the last 20 years or so of progress in AI research has been made. Often he's referred to as the father of deep learning. And I think if nothing else, what this quote exemplifies is how even incredibly intelligent people can sometimes say some very daft things. And I know it makes me feel a lot more comfortable every time I get on stage to know that even someone as accomplished as Geoffrey can make a mistake like this. The point that he was trying to make was that advances in image-based deep learning were so great that in 5 years from the point at which he made this statement, we would no longer need radiologists. Now that was back in 2016, and I hope it comes as absolutely no surprise at all that none of my radiologist friends have been made redundant. If we actually thought that their jobs were as simple as just identifying suspicious elements of a scan, then we'd have replaced them with pigeons. And I'm not joking. Pigeons are actually quite good at diagnosing things like microcalcifications in mammograms. Fortunately, they're also really low maintenance. No expensive software engineer, no data science, no expert in AI needed. Just a little bit of bread and some operant conditioning. Now, I think the point here is, as funny as the pigeon example was, Geoffrey's quote glosses over the fact that there are two very distinct worlds within the field of artificial intelligence: general intelligence and narrow intelligence. And whilst I know that he knows the difference, grand claims about making entire jobs defunct don't really lend themselves to what is quite a nuanced distinction. So what I want to do is use an example to see if we can really pin it down. And the one that I like to use is one that I think that people most often intuitively understand, because it's based on a conversation you could have had with Siri back in 2012. If you had told Siri that you want to jump off a bridge, Siri would have responded, "Okay, Bilal, there are 3 bridges nearby. The closest one is 1.5 miles away. Would you like me to show you how to get there using Apple Maps?" I know, Apple Maps. There's also the issue that Siri just facilitated suicide, which is clearly not the intelligent response in that situation. Now, I know that people will say a lot's happened in the last 8 years, and we now have language models with several hundred billion parameters, but that hasn't changed the core issue. These models are nothing more than incredibly sophisticated parrots. They don't really understand language, because if they did, contextual subtleties like that one wouldn't confuse them, as I'm sure it didn't confuse any of you. What I really want to drive home is the idea that we aren't talking about artificial general intelligence, at least not where it concerns healthcare applications. And I'm going to try and hit all the generations here. There's no HAL 9000, there's no Terminator, and there's definitely no Ultron that we need to be worried about. More often than not, in the healthcare domain, what we are talking about is automated interpretation of diagnostic tests like scans, or prognosticating outcomes so that we can personalize medication decisions. Now that I think we're all on the same page, what I want to talk about is how we have enough to worry about without adding in some sort of malevolent AI that wants to destroy the world. Because believe it or not, we do have enough to worry about. Geoffrey got to make a bold proclamation, which clearly I disagree with. So let me make one of my own. What keeps me up at night isn't the possibility that I, as a physician, am about to be replaced, but rather the fact that we're introducing artificial intelligence-based tools into routine clinical practice with absolutely no guarantee that they're going to improve the lives of our patients. And that is the essence of why we aren't ready for the AI revolution. In the vast majority of cases, we have nothing more to show than a simulation of how these tools are going to impact human health. And believe it or not, we've lived through a version of this disaster already. And if we don't take notice of the lessons of history, we're just going to repeat them. So one of the first true examples of artificial intelligence in healthcare was computer-aided detection. And specifically, it was computer-aided detection of suspicious regions in mammograms for breast cancer screening. If I remember correctly, the first FDA-approved product hit the market in the late 1990s. And by 2008, 3/4 of all screening mammograms carried out in the US used this technology. And the claim was simple. If you used computer-aided detection, your ability to detect abnormalities was as good, if not better, than a breast cancer specialist. In truth, though, it's how we evidence that claim, which I think lays bare the core issue with how we want to regulate, or how we currently regulate artificial intelligence in health. In essence, what happened was that radiologists' performance was tested either with or without the software on thousands of mammograms that have been collected over several years, a process that we call retrospective validation. The important thing to note there is that the women whose mammograms were being looked at probably had no idea this was going on at all. Effectively, what we've done is we divorced the validation process from reality. And what we've done is simulate what would happen if that AI-based tool had been used, but without any actual understanding of what the downstream consequences were to those women. Because remember, they'd come to the clinic, they'd had their mammogram, and they'd received their treatment. And what we'd done is bank that information so that we could test the AI on it later. The women were never involved. It took a decade for the healthcare community to realize that the claims of more accurate diagnostics didn't necessarily mean better outcomes for patients. The long list of sins that we eventually discovered while monitoring the real-world performance of this technology included more women being called back for unnecessary rescanning, additional biopsies that didn't seem to be translating into more cases of invasive breast cancer being detected. And for many, the final blow came with a landmark study about 10 years ago that looked at 500,000 mammograms and found that the only thing that computer-aided detection technology definitely did do was increase the cost of provision and line the pockets of the companies that were selling it. But that's just one example, right? There are always edge cases. Well, unfortunately, this isn't an edge case. It's an issue we've been grappling with for years, and since long before the advent of AI in healthcare. And I promise you, this is the only paper that I'm going to talk to you about in any detail. And all that I'm really hoping you'll take away is the title. This is one of a handful of reviews that sought to figure out what happens when you have a better diagnostic test. What does that really mean for our patients? And this one in particular, again, if I recall correctly, synthesized the results of about 123 studies that directly compared a newer, better test to the current state of the art. And the conclusion that they came to was that there was absolutely no relationship between how much better the newer test was and the eventual impact it had on patient-centered outcomes, like mortality risk or quality of life. And the real problem is that when they looked a little bit deeper, less than 20% of those quote unquote better tools had any benefit at all to speak of. I think the lesson here is quite important. You can build a better AI-based tool, but when you define better by how much more accurate it is, instead of how many people it helps, you're setting yourself up to fail. So if we can't guarantee that it's going to generate any benefit for patients, will it at least make things more efficient? Now, the breast cancer example would suggest not. And unfortunately, it's just been a pile-on since. Although it's not an AI-based tool, I think there was a neat example that was a study done in Wales a few years ago, which demonstrates just how necessary these evaluation exercises are prior to widespread implementation. What the investigators of that study set about to do was determine how effective a model was. And what the model did was it predicted the risk of an emergency admission to hospital for tens of thousands of people across Wales. And that risk was what would happen over the next 12 months. And they took those scores and they gave it to each person's general practitioner so they could try and intervene to prevent those that were considered high risk ending up in hospital. Essentially a type of targeted preventative medicine, what we all dream of what the future of healthcare looks like. And again, the conclusion the study came to was that whilst the tool itself was highly accurate, what it did was increase the number of visits to the emergency department, increase the cost of service provision, increase the number of hospital admissions, but again, without any clear benefit to the patients. Simply put, assume nothing. Whilst it's entirely logical to think that if you make one part of a machine more efficient, that you're going to make the machine globally more efficient, in reality, the complexities of healthcare provision mean that that's possibly one of the most dangerous assumptions you can make. So here we are. But what does here mean, right? In the US, the FDA has authorized at least 70 AI-based tools to go to market. In Europe, we're not far behind. But in both contexts, nothing much has changed on the regulatory front since the breast cancer example I shared earlier on. The vast majority of these tools have been given whatever form of authorization they have, based on that retrospective validation that I described. And if I was giving this presentation a year ago, I would have stopped here and I've told you it's all the regulators' fault. Blame them, tell them they need to fix it and move on. But the last year has given me a lot of time to think. And in my job at the Wellcome Trust, I've had the privilege of talking to people much smarter than myself. And I'm going to call out one group in particular. They're called Understanding Patient Data. And if you've never heard of them, I'm really hoping someone from the group is watching today, because I will be retweeting all of their stuff like mad. I promise you, it's the most useful thing you're going to read on this topic for a long time. And the opportunity to speak to these people has led me to the conclusion, or kind of that light bulb moment for me, was realizing that blaming the regulators is the easy way out. Regulators are meant to be the last line of defense, not the first. So if anyone's failed, it's academics, it's research funders. In short, it's people like me. And we failed in a really specific way. At the Wellcome, we talk about something called trustworthiness by design. I can't make you trust something. That's a deeply personal thing. It's influenced by a whole bunch of contexts that I can't control. But what I can do is make sure that the processes and the technology that we let out into the world is worthy of your trust. But to figure out what trustworthy means to people, believe it or not, you actually need to talk to real people. And I know I say that in a somewhat facetious way, but the struggle is real. And I'm going to give you a quick example to demonstrate that. So again, I think a few months ago, a study was published where the authors looked at all of the comments that had been submitted to the FDA's public consultation on a series of updates that they had proposed to the regulation of AI-based tools in healthcare. And what they found was less than 5% of those submissions came from individuals, members of the public. Over 50% came from industry. And more than 2/3 of all of the submissions declared some form of financial interest or a conflict of interest. Suddenly, it makes a lot more sense how we've ended up with the model we have, right? And why the proposed updates really don't do much to change it. What we fail to do is capture the opinions of those that regulation is meant to protect. But again, blaming the regulators is easy. And the regulation we have is a symptom of a larger problem. In truth, the short-sightedness we're seeing here is one that we see throughout science. Engagement with the public is seen as only being worthwhile for inputting on issues of user experience or design, rather than informing the more fundamental decisions of principally how we do something, or whether we should be doing it at all. Somewhere along the way, we forgot that the only way to really know how to set up regulation that protects people's best interests is to make sure they're involved in the process, so that they can help us select the right guardrails. Often people make the argument that the public just isn't interested in weighing in on policy, right? We all know that's a weak excuse, largely because it reflects the fact that we're sharing incredibly complex documents that are filled with jargon and just expecting people to come up with their own opinions on it. If we've learned anything over the last few months, it's that when people really care about something, for example, the safety of a new vaccine, suddenly they're able, or they find the time to understand what's going on. But when you don't have a pandemic illness motivating people to take notice of an issue, that responsibility to engage the public is on us. And to do that, the easiest way to do that is to meet them where they are, to use a model that they're more familiar with. And believe it or not, it's not that hard. If you replace the word AI with a common drug in every example I've used thus far, it's easy to see just how starkly different the process is from the ones that we're much more familiar with, like pharmaceutical regulation. If a doctor came up to you and suggested prescribing a drug that they'd simulated the impact of on data they collected in the last 10 years, you'd probably, quite rightly so, be a little bit concerned, right? If they reassured you by explaining how they'll collect information on everyone who receives it going forward to, one, make sure that it's safe, and two, that it's actually effective in practice, at minimum, I suspect many of you wouldn't feel comfortable taking it. At worst, some of you might be reaching for the phone to call the licensing board for that position to report them for unethical practice. So why on earth do we think that that's okay and sufficient for artificial intelligence? So I promised you a solution. And what makes my life that much easier is I don't have to reinvent the wheel here. All I need to do is parrot back what we've been doing for pretty much every other medical intervention for the last 60 years. And it comes down to three changes. The first is that we need prospective instead of retrospective trials. And I imagine many of you are looking at that first picture and thinking, what on earth does that have to do with either of those? And the point that I was trying to make is that if you simulate the impact of something, instead of integrating these tools into real world care pathways so that you can measure their impact, you're not going to capture the real world. You're not going to capture the messiness of day-to-day healthcare provision. And thus, why would anyone trust that the effectiveness you've reported is anything close to what we'll observe when we eventually getting around to using the tool? Second, we need to start focusing on patient-centered outcomes. There is absolutely no point calculating a prediction or getting a tool to give you a diagnosis if you're not going to use it. Figuring out how accurate these tools are, as we've already seen, only tells you so much. So we actually need to test if there's a downstream benefit to people or the system. Third, this all needs to be done before a product goes to market, not afterwards. It's hard to build a case that a process is trustworthy when there is absolutely no demand for evidence that people will benefit as a result of its use. In short, this is the kind of evidence we need to be taking to regulators when we ask for approval, not eventually deciding it's necessary to differentiate products already on the market, as is currently happening. I know of a couple products that have come close to checking these three boxes, but absolutely none that have done all three. And maybe there are a conscientious few that I just don't know about that are trying their best. But the problem is there are dozens of products that are already authorized to go to market that didn't come anywhere close. So here's the kicker. Regardless of whether we're ready or not, the revolution is upon us. AI is already making its way into routine clinical practice. So why did I bother spending, I think I'm close to 19 or 20 minutes, telling you what I have? It's because we're going to be spending the next year dealing with the fallout from this one. And one of the things that we're going to need to deal with is how we regulate artificial intelligence in healthcare for the foreseeable future. The updated regulations that were meant to go into effect in the US and in Europe were meant to come into effect in 2020, but we all decided to delay them for a year because we recognized we had more important things to be getting on with. But what that means is that in early 2021, a whole new set of regulations are going to go live. But it's not up to me to decide whether they comprise a trustworthy process. That's up to all of you. So my simple ask is, if you have 10 minutes, go and read one of the many commentaries about what's on the horizon for us all and come to your own conclusions. And if you're unhappy about something, make sure to let the rest of us know, because making genuinely meaningful change happen is a team effort. And I'll leave it there. Thank you so much all for listening to me.